Cool, Stanford. I'm so glad we're here. And we were just talking about this creator maker space that we've been carving out. Many of us in the BIPOC scholarly creator community do as a kind of natural impulse, but how it's such a difficult. It's a hard path to carve because of the way the institutions work. But Stanford, you were about to share something as well on this.
Well, it actually challenges a whole bunch of norms around the production of scholarly knowledge, especially as it relates to the arts, whether they be the visual arts or the written arts. Because what it is that traditionally, right? Think about it this way: traditionally, you have people who create works of art, in this case, comics, right? And then you have people who come in and say, and as critics and scholars, who then contextualize the work, right? Well, what's happening now is you have scholar creators who can not only create the work but provide the scholarly context for their work, right? So it's actually a threat to it's actually very much a threat to certain producers of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Because what it means is that it makes it more difficult for another scholar to just come along and say, well, I mean, they don't really mm-hmm. They don't really understand. This is what it really means, blah, 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 because we've already built that into the infrastructure. We've already said it. And I think mm-hmm. that that's also important when you're talking about people of color who traditionally have had their lives framed and reconfigured through the eyes of people who are not themselves. And we know how important that is. We know that's important because, well, the phrase double consciousness, seeing mm-hmm. oneself through the eyes of the other, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, talk about engaging in a creative practice that undercuts that. I think it's incredibly important. I think that mm-hmm. that there's a level of self-determination that comes into play when you have scholar creators. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of the things that is really, really interesting. I think it's interesting in your work, and I think that what and it's important in my work. And then there's another thing that adds to the work, which is that I do a lot of stuff where I talk about the construction of identity in comics. And what it allows me to do is to have a different kind of understanding of those constructions, right? Not just to understand it from the story that someone tells me, but to understand it through my experiences and mm-hmm. to be able to layer those and incorporate those experiences into the work. When I first was pulled into the academy at the time, I had a weekly comic strip retelling African folktales, and I remember having one of the professors in my department telling me, oh, well, clearly you have Pan-African ideological leanings, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, no. She's like, no. Well, if you look at the way in which you have this generalized African look, as far as the background and the way you put all the stuff together, it very much has that. And she pulled the, you don't really understand what you were doing, to which my response was, well, when I originally proposed the idea, instead of it being a 3-panel strip, it had a 4th panel. And the 4th panel was going to be a graphic of a globe that would point to exactly where that came from. So you could see the different types of groups that were producing the folktales. Oh, and when I sold them the idea, they came back to me and said that instead of having different backgrounds, which I had originally had, they wanted generalized Africa to make it easier for the audiences. And so, and I remember when I said that, it was like I burst her bubble. I mean, it was like it was just, but it's interesting because in my experiencing that, I could articulate that the construction of an African identity in my comic strip, it wasn't just a part of me, it was actually part of my engagement with the system. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No.
And mm-hmm. I mean, I'd love to hear some thoughts in terms of your work, in terms of your experiences. Like, how has being somebody who's also participated in making, how has it altered your scholarship?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stanford. And maybe it kind of comes from something you mentioned earlier in our kind of origin stories as kids of color in this country. The lived, not just the concept, but the lived experience of the double consciousness. And kind of looking back and looking at my journey and why I was kind of drawn to comics in the very first place, after we moved from Mexico City, and kind of as my safe space for imagining and for learning language in a country that was pretty hostile to me, physically even, abusive, because of my maternal tongue, Spanish, and so on. I just wonder if, it's almost not surprising that you and I find such sure footing in this creator maker space today as adults, as thinkers who think and create simultaneously, because we're thinking and creating constantly for those kids that we were but didn't have us around as adults.
Right.
So yeah, it's this kind of, back to the future, present, past kind of puzzle, but I think that's what we're getting at here, really, Stanford. Even, I know in your writing and my writing, even if there isn't a comic involved directly, we never write in such a way that we alienate our readers and our audiences. We write to invite and to enrich. And I think comics has always been that kind of a place for me, and I speak for you too, but but like you said, I mean, in many ways we're kind of the veterans here. We're some of the first scholar makers to be doing this work. And now I have PhD students, et cetera, that are, coming up and doing these really cool dissertations. But, that wasn't a possibility for us, when we were going up through the higher education system. So we kind of had to carve these spaces out. And the system itself, even today, like, if you talked, the minute I say I teach comics, and then I tell people I teach very specific kind of areas of comics that are focused on BIPOC and, LGBTQ plus creators and stories, people, are like, you just do fluff. And, if I were to say, no, I do this and this, I don't know, Shakespeare and the brain or something, get a completely different response, right? But yeah, I think that's it. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's also part of like the fabric of who we've become, but started, in our journey that started, as little ones, right?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, for me, it was, I've told many people, I learned to read because my mother would not read me my comic books on demand. So for me, reading is like perpetually an act of spite. But the thing is that, like, I remember my mom actually, I don't know if you know this, but my mom is a retired ESL teacher. So for her, exposing me to comics, it really was about giving me another outlet. But I was also growing up as, my family, to be a carpenter was to be Black where we were, because we were like the only ones, or one of a very small number of families. And so, even my looking at the construction of identity in comics is very much about me engaging and re-engaging my past, right? Of consuming these narratives where I loved the heroic narratives, but I was always critical of the absences, right?
Mm-hmm.
but I also found in the portrayals that were there, because they were so stereotypical, that I myself personally was actually at a young age, instead of going out and exploring who I could be, I was limiting who I would be perceived as, because I was always put in this position of having to brush up against or counter the stereotypes, right? You know, I mean, recently it came up in a conversation we were talking about beauty standards, and I was talking about how, like, yeah, in middle school I had a teacher actually pull me aside and tell me that, you know, because I had an Afro pick, right? That had, it was the, you know, those old ones with the little fist on it and also the little peace sign, and she chastised me for having it, and she's like, you can't have that in school, it's dangerous. And then as I was walking away, she called me back and she told me that she told me like you can't talk about Black power and you can't say Black is beautiful. Like, I was told that in middle school. You know, here I am supposed to be forming my ideas, my identity myself, right? And so for her, it was about these dangerous politics, right? In this very conservative Republican piece of land, and you know, but for me, that was also about me in a way that, and to this day, I'd be willing to bet she didn't even remember saying that to me. But that's actually where my interest in, it's not just that I'm interested in like how many Black superheroes they are. I'm interested in how it is that we have a medium where people make identity from blank pieces of paper, and we still get all of these problematic representations. And even the people who make them will admit that the representations are problematic. I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in that because that is something that I was pushing up against as a child, right? You know, and I think that there's a lot of that in scholarship, period. It's just that when you're a person of color, right, it's also inflected in the ways in which you brush up against what is essentially a white-centric system.
Yeah, really powerful. Stanford, and yeah, you know, it is, you know, I mentioned too a kind of floodgate that opened once I got tenure, and part of that floodgate was because, you know, these books that you know, we're looking at right now, including some of the recent ones that I know you're very familiar with, like the Routledge Companion to Gender and Sexuality and Graphic Indigeneity, the Oxford Handbook that I also just published. You know, all of that stuff had to wait until I was tenured. And it kind of gets back to, you know, that the, not just whiteness in general, but how the institution's whiteness ascribes value.
Right.
And, you know, shoot, you know, we're talking, you know, I finished my PhD and did a postdoc. My first job was in 2000. So, I mean, it's not that long ago that we're talking about this. And, you know, there's still some struggle, but, you know, we're opening these spaces. We're making those spaces happen, right, in our scholarship. And, you know, what's interesting, and I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about it too, is that without our work, and I don't mean to say like, you know, I don't mean to put out there that like this is end all be all stuff, but without it, we have such a skewed, just talking about comics, such a skewed understanding of even like basics, like the history of the form,
Right.
you know, and until we can get this stuff out there, it will continue to perpetuate itself in this really skewed way. I just taught the Intro to Comic Studies here at OSU this fall, and I used a book. I think it's called Introduction to Comic Studies, that was just published, and there's absolutely nothing on kind of issues of race directly or issues of like sexuality. And so, I had to augment and kind of play with, and here we are, so 2020, 2021, and the handbook, the textbook for that I used, like now, of course, I now have stuff out there that I can use for future iterations. Would have, if I hadn't been there, given the students a really kind of very US centric, but then even within that US centric point of view, a very white kind of male dominant perspective.
Right. And I think that that's, because I also think when I look at a lot of the books that attempt to cover large swaths, what I'm seeing, it's always like, well, okay, we'll have the chapter for colored people, right? We'll have the we'll have the chapter for the people, we'll have one chapter for people of color and one chapter that meets the international component, right? And the fact that they get pushed off as a chapter oftentimes by scholars who talk about intersectionality, right? Who are versed in intersectionality because we've spoken to them, we relate to them, right? But somehow it gets left out, and I don't just blame the scholars for that. That's something where you have to really start looking at. You have to start looking at acquisition editors. You have to look at the people who are the publishers for the books, because they're looking at it and they're like, oh, well, you can address that by checking this box. And I think that's what makes your work different. I think that's what makes what makes our work different, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not thinking of it in terms of checking a box.
Mm-hmm.
We're thinking of it as something that is laced and woven in. I mean, I keep thinking when I was doing my research, like one of the things I did was for a while when I was collecting my interviews, I stopped allowing people to look at them to just be like, oh, to let the whiteness in them be unstated. Like I actually would I started asking everybody who I spoke to, tell me, and we're talking, I'm recording this, right? Tell me how you identify yourself. That is the most interesting question, because you start to realize that the creators who are most sensitive to the representations of others are the ones who define themselves in smaller units. So it's when you get like like I remember talking to Don McGregor, white guy who worked on Black Panther, and he but he didn't describe himself. He described himself as the son of a Maine fisherman, or you have somebody describe themselves as Italian American, as being Catholic, as being Jewish, right? So what I was finding is that those people who did the best job in their day, because you can always look at them differently over time, were those people who had some sort of ethnic identification or some sort of religious identification that pulled them numerically out of being in the minority. No, I'm sorry. Let me correct myself. Out of being in the majority, right? It pulled them into minority, into like minority status in terms of like if you're going to go raw numbers, right? It is this ability to imagine themselves as being outnumbered that seemed to make them a little more sensitive to what it must be like for other people. Did it make for perfect representation? No. But but you could see a clear line in terms of what they were doing versus what people who didn't see themselves in that way were doing, right? I think that's one of the things that does. I think it makes it's part of what makes our work interesting is that, right? Is that we ask those kinds of questions. And those questions are very much rooted in what? Our biographies.
Yeah, no, it's great. Stanford, I'm going to push us into another space, which is kind of teaching by other means. And I know that you and I both do this you know, podcasting, popcasting, etc. Also, you know, filmmaking, radio. I know you do radio. And I wanted to show a little bit of the documentary, the trailer for, you know, Latinx superheroes that I know you're familiar with. You know, you have your different platforms, you know, these kind of spaces that are welcoming and that kind of erase that line in the sand between ivory tower, say, learning and teaching and communities. But yeah, why don't we talk a little bit about that, Stanford?
Well, yeah, I think that it's interesting because some people refer to it as, you know, being a public intellectual, being, you know, they talk about it in terms of accessibility. But I really think that honestly, I think that that theory there's a certain elegance to theory, right? I think that a truly elegant theory will take that which is simple and make it complex, and that which is complex and make it simple at the same time. That it should bridge. That it actually should serve as a bridge. You should be able to use it to explain something that you cannot through any other language. And if it's not doing that, then I question its value in that moment, right? You know, I think that sometimes, especially as credentialed scholars, right, we're raised in these systems of knowledge, but these systems where we get power through using certain kinds of words, right? And often these words are more and more like specific to our disciplines, you know, which I actually find to be interesting because, you know, we use the word discipline. I mean, what does the word discipline really mean? You know, getting someone to behave in a certain way, that's what we're doing. We're being disciplined by our disciplines, you know. But I think that those types of moves, you know, they also are about power, right? And I think that by investing in trying to think things through, without the artifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that what it does is it actually adds a clarity to what we do.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, you know, and I use the word clarity instead of accessibility because accessibility is, I think clarity is what's important. I think even in the ivory tower, right? Clarity
Mm-hmm.
is important. And I think that if what you have to say is important, then it should be clear enough that a maximum number of people can understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm completely with you. And I also like how clarity for both of us and for, you know, others of our brothers and sisters out there doing this important work, clarity isn't something that's additive. It's like clarity is what we are and who we are and what we do. Like,
Right.
you know, I don't have to sit down and think, oh, I need to make this, you know, clear. It just is. And no matter kind of how sophisticated, you know, the concept, you know, it's just, that's the way it is. And we've never had the luxury of luxuriating in kind of theory for theory's sake. Thank goodness, I will say. This leads me to kind of the really cool things that you and I are really actively participating in, which is our Comic Cons, and how we work together. We work separately in these different kind of regional spaces, and then together to lift each other, all of us together, the big boat. And I don't see that happening in other cons with other cons, like BCAF. We're doing this for BCAF right now, and SoulCon and the Texas Latino Comic Con, all these things kind of Indigicon, right? I don't know, Stanford, what's your sense of this?
I mean, I think that that's actually where the most interesting interventions happen, right? I think it does come back to some of the things that we talked about earlier about biography. I feel like I feel like when I participate in these cons that I'm giving, I'm actually doing it for Stanford Carpenter of 20, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm not, mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That like we are doing for a different generation what we, and providing for a different generation what we wish we had had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is important. I think that's, and I don't think that's important in terms of like, oh, these are lofty goals or something like that. I think it's actually a very important part of the development of culture. I think that is actually very much a part of how people grow, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I gosh, I put it in my, it's buried in my dissertation. I made this comment that each generation wakes up one day, looks at the world around them and says, there's something wrong here. And then they try and figure out how to they dream a better life, and then they dream a better world, and they make it so. And then the next generation lives in the world that the previous generation dreamed, looks at it and says, gosh, this is really messed up. And they dream of a better world and make it so, right? So it's actually these cycles of dreaming forward, looking back, and creating out of the past to then realize that future, and in that way, I mean, it's also a description of Sankofa, right? And that is actually how we move through space and time. That's what creates the opportunities that we had. I mean, when I was doing my work, it was like, people looked at me really strange. It was like, you're black and you're talking about black comics. Are there black comics out there? Like, most people didn't even, you know what I mean? It's like, that's the type of feedback I was getting. It's like, what? There are black people who make comics, and there are black superheroes, and yes. But I think what's interesting is that the people, like when I got my first Smithsonian fellowship, when they accepted me, it was actually a group of baby boomer scholars and museum workers who looked at my work, and they're like, they were looking at something that I was trying to do. It wasn't something that they would have done themselves, right? But that's kind of how the generations work, right? Like what you would do yourself and what you would greenlight are two different things. But they were willing to see value and give me the resources and the space to push my dream forward. Even if they didn't quite get it, what they got was that I was doing something interesting enough for them to like throw a few resources my way, right? And I think that's what's happening with these comic conventions. It's this moment where we can be like, where we're basically like, hey, I didn't have that as a kid. Okay, let's do that. Let's do that, right? But what's interesting is what happens with these people who come to these conventions, right? And not just the kids, but also their parents, right? When a parent and a child come to, a black parent and a black child, or a brown parent and a brown child come to these events, and they're able to experience and learn this together, it informs how they're going to interact when they leave, right? You know, my dad loved me, my mom loved me, and they didn't, you know, but we didn't have this, right? It was just, it was literally us feeling around in the dark together, you know? So, you know,
I mean, I think what we're talking about here is also re-engineering, conceptualizing the concept and practice of tradition, because what we're doing is we're making traditions that weren't there for us, but that are becoming, they're solidifying, but they're also evolving traditions in the present tense.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love it. And, you know, this is just a little clip from SoulCon. You and I have been kind of, you know, working on this together. So it's such an important space for this tradition making. And yeah, it's something I look forward to like every year. I mean, without, there's nothing more except for maybe BCAF, because I get to see you all, and we're doing everything in the celebration of MLK. But yeah, SoulCon, Stanford, like and BCAF, like it's like nuts, right?
And it is. It's also time for it. What's fascinating about it is there's the event itself, but then there's something else that happens, which is the fellowship, right? You know, I mean, it's interesting because SoulCon and BCAF are in some ways subtly different experiences for me, because SoulCon, you know, I live in Chicago, and so usually for every SoulCon I've been to, I've always driven. So, you know, it means driving through the hinterlands. It's driving through areas of Indiana and Ohio where, as the sun goes down, you start to realize that, you know, you're out in places where no one would hear you scream, and if someone does, they probably won't care. You know, and it's like, and then you get to then I get to Columbus, and it's like, oh, my people. You know, and there's always, you know, always getting in the evening and meeting for dinner and catching up and being with kindred spirits, right? BCAF is a little different because it's Chicago to the Bay Area. So it's like, you know, it's getting on a plane. So it's not the same type of transition. And I think that, and it's also the West Coast, right? I love the Midwest. And I love that SoulCon is in the Midwest. I love BCAF. It's a chance for me to go out West, and my parents have since relocated out West, so I get a chance to see them. And again, it's the same thing. It's like, it is the fellowship, right? But it's very much inflected by it's also very much inflected by the region and the cities that they're in. You know, Columbus and San Francisco are two very different animals.
Yeah, no, I get it too. And also I feel like that kind of liminal, kind of transitional space that you talked about from Chicago driving to Columbus and then arriving, and also the sense that we're still in a US where we have to actively conjoin, like, you know, and San Francisco, I love BCAF and San Francisco, but I don't feel that same sense of urgency at BCAF. Like you said, region, history of space, of location, and of course I love seeing everybody, but I don't feel the same urgency of fellowship that Columbus does for us.
Well, because Columbus is surrounded by hinterlands, right?
Yeah.
And Columbus is actually a much more conservative city. I think that the people who come together for SoulCon tend to be coming from much more marginal spaces, whereas the Bay Area is already built as this multicultural melting pot, in the same way New York is, right? Like going to like I always find going to New York Comic Con is a very different experience, mainly because you're surrounded by New York, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that the other thing is that BCAF takes place during the Martin Luther King celebration, which is not just San Francisco. It is
Mm-hmm.
like it's the entire Bay Area. They have a march of
Mm-hmm.
people descending onto it. The
Mm-hmm.
the mayor
Yeah.
of San Francisco always speaks there. So it's a very loud, proud out experience.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas even when you're in Columbus, it's like we have it's in these different spaces that are carved out in Columbus, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got
Mm-hmm.
stuff happening on the university campus, and you've got and you've got the Billy Ireland Museum, but then you've got like these other spaces that we went to. Like I remember we went to this one
Oh.
soiree where it was downtown. I remember
Mm.
going past some of the judicial buildings and stuff downtown at night and being like, wow,
Mm-hmm.
this is really, you know what I mean? It's just like, it's very quiet. And then you go
Mm-hmm.
and you park your car, you're walking down the quiet street, and walk down the quiet street, and then you go into this room and it's like, whoo, right? Or you go in this building and it just opens up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's just, it makes it very different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's just a whole different kind of feel, you know.
Yeah.
But I think that what is one of the differences though is that is intimacy, right? Is the intimacies are also different.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually one of the things that's most important about these types of events is that for people who are scholars and creators, is it provides these more intimate gatherings. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's actually one of the things that's been difficult about the pandemic, right? Is that you don't get those types of intimacies on a screen.
Yeah. Speaking of intimacies, I'm going to move us in through a couple of cool projects that I've been creating, and I know you know some of these, but yeah, and also kind of using, not using, but drawing on our experiences, our histories, our ancestral heritage, but in ways that also kind of push us into future spaces and that celebrate, BIPOC thinkers and creators. And one of the things about Labyrinth's Born, the comic, the graphic novel that I'm finishing up right now, is, I really wanted it to be to kind of revolve around these young folk. And in fact, the world, we're set in 2041, and the event has happened, and it's actually all the old people. Something happens to their bone marrow. I don't go into it, it's not important. And they like literally kind of melt away. And it's the young people that have to learn how to kind of reset, reboot, and what I really wanted to do there was, take, someone like Cassandra, and it's it's an epistolary, it's a kind of comic graphic novel told in these journal entries that she writes and letters that the papa writes, but that he knows will never get to her.
Right.
And but what it means to use our minds, our brains in creative ways, and to have an event, let's call it today we would call it the pandemic, but not to be straitjacketed and fearful and kind of, or straitjacketed by fear that takes us back to kind of patterns and behaving and ways of thinking that are destructive, but really tries to imagine us in a future tomorrow, because this is a real opportunity. And we're just talking about this with what's happening right now. um, you know um, in DC, you know, you see the fear, and it's the fear that drives the anger, that drives the violence, because there's a population in this country that has been privileged and honored because of skin phenotype and birth, accident of birth, who are now in a position where they're seeing their own fragility, and instead of seeing it as an opportunity to think and feel and behave in new ways, they're retrenching into this darkness, right?
Yep.
But yeah, Labyrinth's born, the bunker, the kids, and then Dora, you know, another one that's kind of, you know, there was a moment when I was so upset about the way our families are being ripped apart and children put in detention ice cages. And I didn't want to write it as a fiction, alphabetic fiction. I didn't want to write it as a kind of a scholarly article or something like that. I felt compelled to do a comic, and a comic from the point of view of the little girl who's separated from her mama and her little brother, and what it means to be kind of seeing these big giants wearing these green suits, and being kind of directed and told in these like stentorian, stern voices by a judge that you have done something wrong, and the prison, what it must feel like for these little ones, you know. And the comic was the only, for me, really the only like possible place for this. The comic, you know, the visual, the dominant of the visual, even though there's a lot of words here, it's still driven by her perspective and her, you know, and the color and the shape, you know, this moment in the end where she's pulling the scratchy blanket up, and then this little 2-pager that I did with our good friend John Jennings, that's, you know, biographical. And, you know, I put this here, Stanford, because I wanted to remind our viewers and listeners that while the Black experience, the brown experience, and even within those experiences there's a lot of variety, there's a lot of common ground, and there's a lot of things that you and I can talk about where I don't have to explain anything.
Right.
Like, you just get it. And so what it means when we gather, when we have our kind of urgent needs for fellowship that we were talking about with BCAF and SoulCon, is instead of us constantly having to educate people, we're constantly moving forward with our experiences, our knowledge, our journeys that we're sharing, you know. And it was very much like that with John, you know. I told him a couple of little things, and, you know, he got it. He got like the bars on the windows, you know, single parent kind of upbringing and what that meant, and how all of us, no matter kind of how, you know, we've been put on paths to kind of educate ourselves out of situations of danger, that never leaves us, right? That never leaves us. It's right there. It's always in, you know, because of the racial politics of this country. But I was, yeah, maybe while I've been talking, you've been thinking about some stuff here too.
Well, and I think what's interesting is what it means. Part of what's also interesting about what it means when you're with people, when you have those common experiences, is that you can move forward because you don't have to go back and explain the same things, right? It actually supercharges your ability to do things, and I think of it this way: it's like if you can run 100 meters in 10 seconds, right? But you have to step back 10 meters before you can start your 100-meter run, and you only have 10 seconds, you're never going to get to the end. And that's what it is to be in a situation where you have to explain to somebody. You never get, there's just a certain part that you never get to, because by the time you do the explanations, by the time you do this, you've eaten up a certain amount of the time and the energy for the discourse. So the discourse only goes so far. I find that the discourse goes further, right? I find the discourse also goes differently, because you filtered out a set of assumptions, and there's just certain things that I've come to believe that it's important. I've come to believe it's important for people to be able to caucus, because every group has those things that are dear to them that other groups are not all that interested in talking about. So you kind of have to caucus in order to get to the point where you can develop it in such a way that you can bring it back to the other groups that aren't as interested, right? Mm-hmm. So I think so I look at it in terms of the structure of discourse. I think that's one of the things that is really, really important that we lose sight of. We lose sight of it. And then there's some other things, which is that when we are in these situations where we have to explain, we actually cease to become producers of knowledge in favor of becoming somebody else's pedagogical tool. Mm-hmm. Right. So we literally go from being subject to object.
Yeah. Which our students, that if there's anything that they hate more, is being the one kid that's called on to explain the Black experience.
Exactly.
It's really? Yeah, no, I'm with you on that one. The Adventures of Chupacabra Charlie is just a really fun, but also important story that I wanted to tell. And it also involves those, the detention, the ice cages, and the freeing of children. And our creative work, Stanford, I know you're also in this space. I mean, it's doing all this, intertransmedial work. Right. I'm not just happy with alphabetic fiction writing. It's fine, I like it, but I want to do all sorts. I want to go nuts on this stuff, right? We don't even know what new storytelling media is going to look like, but I want to be the one that's carving that space, and pop culture for both of us is so important. Comics, pop culture, does it get in? I mean, this is the place of knowledge production. You were just talking about that, knowledge production, and not being the one where we have to sit around and wait, but where we're doing the knowledge making, because we're right there with the creators. We ourselves are creators, and we're doing this work, right?
Right.
Yeah. I don't know, Stanford, did you want to add something to that? Because I don't know, it's a lot of important, cool stuff that we're doing here.
And I think that's the thing. It's the way it's able to, when we are in our silos, we are the one who does that, right? But when we come together, we are a people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's really interesting, right? Mm-hmm. And I also think it's interesting that we're encouraged to think of pop culture as being this separate thing. What we often forget is that in his day, Shakespeare was pop culture. Mm-hmm. Joseph Conrad was Pulp Fiction.
Right. Right.
I mean, so what makes it, this whole distinction between high and low art, right? Mm-hmm. We have to not be able to buy it in order mm-hmm. to make what we make. But if you start looking at where these distinctions between high art and low art come from, it really comes from a whole bunch of stuff was created in a popular setting. 80% of it gets forgotten. 20% of it gets picked up and put on a pedestal, right? Mm-hmm. but that 20% is put up like that 20% is 100%. Well, if you got to skim off, I mean, because a lot of pop culture is people say it's very trite, right? But the thing is, if you got to skim off 20% of pop culture and make everyone think that is the only thing that came out of popular culture, pop culture looked pretty good, right? It would look very different, and it would look a lot like Shakespeare. Shakespeare wasn't the only playwright of his day. He's just the only one that was saved, right? And even comics, I think what's interesting is like the comics that we teach, is it's not just about whether a comic is good or not. It's about whether it's in print and available at a college bookstore.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's a bunch. And, it's exactly that. Like, I like to teach these, but it's also a question of like, I put them in front of the students, like they're there. They're like part of the curriculum. But, it's unfortunately, it's not the case for even all comic book readers that they know about, like the great vitality of Latinx comics, of BIPOC comics. In fact, I would argue, and I know you would also argue this, that is really where the vitality of comics future is in the BIPOC creators spaces.
Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Stanford, I know we have to kind of wrap this up, but what can we say except that like BIPOC stories matter, comics creation, scholar makers, comic cons, the urgent kind of fellowship spaces that we create, BCAF, our books, our comic books that we make, popular culture. It all matters.
Yep. And it's not just that it matters, it's that it's not accidental. It's that it's not accidental. It matters because quite frankly, we're doing the work to give it meaning. And we're doing it in the context of having rich experiences, but also having deep training, right? I think that oftentimes, what I think is interesting is that even though you say that you teach comics at college, they just here teach comics, right? And you have your alter ego, Professor Latinx, right? The question is, how many people still call you doctor?
Right.
You earned that.
Yeah, that's true.
It wasn't something that you just, that you're walking down the street and you stumbled and fell into it. You earned it. You walked on fire for it, right? You paid your dues for it. And I think that's one of the things that I find to be also really interesting is that I don't know. It's hard because it's like sometimes people look at it and they're like, oh, it's pop culture, but it's not just about it being pop culture. It's about being pop brown culture, pop black culture. That all of a sudden it doesn't have to be dealt with the same type of reverence, and I think that's also what's important about what we do.
Yeah, really excellent point to end on. Gosh, this has been like exhilarating for me. I hope it has also been for our viewers, Stanford.